So my name is Nick Klosky. I am the host or moderator of this talk today from Elna or Dr. Tymes, either way. I'm very happy to present this. This is the San Francisco Regional Mensa monthly gathering, and we have a great speaker today, somebody who has been in our group for quite some time and has always given very interesting discussions on all sorts of different topics. So today is going to be very, very interesting. We have a presentation. Dr. Elna Tymes is a 60-plus year member of Mensa, formerly held the LOCSEC position, which is kind of like our chapter president, and has done just about everything else in San Francisco Regional Mensa. She hosts the popular, which is about 30 years and counting, Start the Month Right event, and is a much published author. And she's now a specialist in Alzheimer's and other dementias. Her doctoral research led her to explore how the brain works. So the topic that we're discussing today is connected to Elna's work on seniors and Alzheimer's, which has led to explorations on how the brain works, such as last year's great regional gathering, San Francisco Mensa Regionals Gathering talk called Where is a Memory? It's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Elna Tymes.
Hi there. I'm glad to be here. This talk is something that just roused my attention after reading snippets in an online presentation, and was very much in line with some of the other work that I have been doing as to how it is that the brain works. I have been doing research into the brain for about 10 or 12 years now, and this is one of these side things that has always piqued my interest. So without further ado, let's start the presentation. Okay, this presentation is not about the conventional definitions of extrasensory perception. We will not be talking about the woo-woo kinds of stuff that frequently go along with it. We're not going to be talking about ghosts. We're not going to be talking about spiritual encounters. We're not going about what I call prekinetic movement, which is basically about the ability to move things without touching them. And we're not going to be talking about alien communications. To some extent, what we were talking about coincides with dreams, but it really doesn't have anything to do with predictive visions. It may help with inspiration, but it's not about inspiration. And it will not address precognition in the sense that anything can be measured in that respect. So here's the map of the brain. It's a very general map, and it's not intended to be of any great resolution, but it will give you an idea as to where it is that the various parts of the brain are that control how your brain works. Not particularly shown here is the hippocampus, which is roughly the top of the reddish memory and learning area, which is where memories start. Impressions come in from all over your brain, get sorted here, get tagged with labels, and then get stored in different kinds of places. Hearing happens in this particular part, but you'll notice that the smell, speech, and emotion and personality are in the green part. Touch is in the top of the yellow part. Movement is over near the top of the green part. Sight is around to the back of the purple part, and balance and coordination is right back under the blue part. Each of these has specific physiological names. I won't go into them. Just know that if you move your hand around your head, you are touching the area these various sensations are handled. So if we were to do a map of your brain, this is what it would look like. It's all biochemical and electrical circuitry. As we will get into this, you'll find that there are large numbers of connections. Each memory involves a particular combination of elements that are mostly biochemical and electronic, or electric rather. Biochemistry is the one that triggers communication. Electricity is the one that carries it. So we do not have a place in your brain where memories are stored. We do have triggers and circuits, and that's how we know where things are. How it is that you know you can remember something is as yet unknown. We don't know exactly where it's stored, except that we do know that you can access it. For instance, in certain studies having to do with schizophrenia, some of the experiments were made that involved a doctor sticking a probe through the skull into the brain and touching a particular area, in which case the very much awake patient was able to recall a particular piece of music. Touching the brain in another area evoked a memory of a picnic with children. Touching another part of the brain recalled the memory of playing a tennis game. These are stored in different places. The memories are actually are actually accumulations of segments that are stored in different places and are kind of like ingredients in a recipe, in that you can use many different parts to make up a memory, and each of those parts can be used with other memories. I have a whole presentation about this that I won't go into here. This is just the background for it. And yes, your brain is far more complex than this. A lot of inputs take place near the surface of the brain, not because of touching it, but because that happens to be where the inputs come in. Each of these little fibers shown in this diagram represents a circuit, a neuron channel. They store memory fragments rather, and they help put things together. Notice that this is what computer users call a distributed network. It is highly distributed. So we never fully program our brains. Our brains basically react to things in the world. If you recall, as babies, they open their eyes and the first thing they see is a bunch of colors, but they don't know what they are. They fuse together within the first couple of days to become outlines of objects. If they are born with hearing, which most are, they also begin to hear sounds. And again, they don't know what those sounds mean, but they begin to weave them together because pleasant sounds are usually accompanied by somebody smiling. So the baby learns to associate a pleasant sound with somebody smiling, and sometimes with laughter. The baby also learns to associate certain things with food. Food makes him feel better, so he learns to associate those things with making him feel better. And of course, as you grow, your brain circuitry is constantly rewritten to be able to handle these outside new pieces of information, to take advantage of opportunities, and to understand not just the social structure around us, but the environment that we live in. And as it says, we have about 86 billion neuron cells that shuttle information back and forth using the voltage spikes and biochemicals. And as you saw in the previous diagram, neutrons are densely connected to each other in networks. And you have hundreds of millions of, or hundreds of trillions of these network connections. Some of them persist, some of them don't. Most of them persist, and frequently, if you lose a particular memory, it's because you haven't used it in ages. So, you are not who you were yesterday. Because you woke up and did what you do in the morning, and you had breakfast, and you did some other things, and you sat down at the computer, you have added information to your brain. You've also probably deleted a few things you didn't need, and you may have changed a couple pieces of information about something that you stored. However, there are elements of your memories that can be reconfigured so that you understand something that's new or something that's related, and that is also stored, and that's called brain plasticity. Brain plasticity refers to your ability to take existing information and combine it in a different way so that it comes up with something that, to you anyway, is new. The more you have of that, the more able you are to think in terms of what normal people think as smart. So what your brain can do is adapt existing solutions or make new ones. Because it's dynamic, it can, in some respects, it resembles hardware, except that the hardware is constantly changing. And so you build a system, which in the computer world would be software, that interacts with the world around it, takes in inputs, and allows that input to change what it is that's stored. So your brain is constantly adjusting itself to reflect these things. If you step on the scale this morning and discover that you had the COVID-15, you may want to do something about that, but you will have at least noticed that. And the fact that your weight is different from what you'd like is another piece of memory that we will have stored. So your brain may, depending on how you are wired, say, oh, I got to do something about that. So today's menu includes a whole lot of salads and soups and not a whole lot of carbs. That's just your brain molding itself to the environment that it's in and using its resources in a efficient way. And when your brain doesn't have the resources it needs, it creates it. Probably the best way to think about it is it's sculpted. If you have ever seen a picture of a neuron, it looks kind of like a tree in that it always has little branches sticking out of it, seeking new connections. That's what we mean by sculpting new memories. Each of those little things sticking out is called an axon. And when it connects with another neuron's axon, it creates a connection that is recorded. That in particular creates a new structure, usually kind of like a tree structure. And you can refer to that, your memory will store it. You can use it to build yet more connections if you want. But it really depends on what your environment is offering and how it is that you feel and a whole bunch of other things like that. So what happens to storage? Well, your memories are not stored as finite packages. They are stored as references to pieces. And those pieces can be reconfigured any way you want so that they create different memories. For instance, your memory of a picnic may have involved children, and you may have been involved in playing baseball with them. That's one picnic. Another picnic may have been in the rain. So your memory will store that as another kind of picnic. Or you may have been picnicking at the beach with a bonfire and a bunch of adult friends who were enjoying some adult beverages. That will also be stored as a picnic. All of those are connected because of common parts, but they also have different parts. So as we pointed out, they include new neurons that are formed by axons that are reaching out to other neurons to form new connections. So if the neurons in one part of the brain run out of storage, they adapt to adjacent unused areas. Now, this is something that nobody has talked about before, but it's like, well, all right, if you amputate a hand, for instance, you will find that there are still memories associated with the hands and memories that are associated with triggering muscles in that hand. But much of that input is taken over by the adjacent cortical areas, such as those in the lower arm, so that if you wind up with an artificial hand that is wired to receive these inputs, your muscles that are now stored in the lower, your memories that are stored as in muscle tissue, or excuse me, are stored in the part of the brain that controls the muscle issue in your lower arm, will be able to connect with those electrical inputs, if you will, in the artificial hand and cause it to grasp or release or form a fist or do whatever hands do. Yeah, as anybody knows, junk accumulates to fill the existing cupboards. But the existing junk doesn't go away, it just gets harder to find. You wind up with, you wind up with a lot of stuff that never gets used, but until sometime in the future, you may remember something that happened when you were a very young child. I don't know that many of you can remember, for instance, as young as 3, I happen to remember, in fact, my earliest memory is of my sister being brought home from the hospital. And I was in the car that brought her home, and I was very frustrated because at 3, I was not allowed to hold her. And I thought that was very unfair. I can remember that picture vividly. Most of us have memories like that. So the ability to remember these things is all about timing. So if the neurons are farther apart, the less strong their signal, and therefore the less likely they are to be able to found easily. You know that. When you try to remember something from your college days, for instance, you may find it hard to remember one of the formulas that was in one of your math classes, for instance. Or you may remember a snippet of memory that has to do with a particular old religion and some of the practices that came with that. However, the neurons are all there. All you have to do is figure out how to string them together. So the neurons that fire together wire together. In other words, they become stronger when they reach each other and fire at the same time as each other. So the younger you are, when the cortical takeovers happen, the more likely they are to persist. In other words, your memories from childhood are very strong, which is one of the reasons why with Alzheimer's patients, they can remember things that happened 30, 50, 60 years ago, frequently even better than they can remember what they had for breakfast this morning. If you're born blind, the territory that is normally occupied by visual processing can get taken over by an adjacent cortical area that's used for processing things like another sound or another touch. So the capacity of your brain is never unused. It's just used for other things if it doesn't get used for what it was originally intended. Good example of blind people needing to use other senses to orient themselves. You can do this yourself. If you make a habit of blindfolding yourself for 2 to 3 hours a day for a week, you will find that because you cannot use your sense of sight, you can in fact improve certain other things. One of the most common things noticed is the ability to orient yourself by the use of sound. Suddenly you're able to perceive how close somebody is or something is without touching it. You can also tell where somebody is by how they walk, and you can tell who they are by how they walk. You can tell how close you are to something like a door or a window because of echolocation and the fact that if you speak up, you will find that you're even more attuned to the echoes that are coming from sound bouncing off the surfaces that you're near. If you are hearing impaired but not blind, people develop the ability to read faces and lips. They also learn how to deduce expressions regardless of what's being said by learning to read the emotions on people's faces. The example given here is for the blind people who were instructors at a school for the blind needed to blindfold themselves and became aware of these other kinds of skills that they have. So the implication is that these extrasensory skills already exist for most people. They're just underused. Let me give you an example. Put your hand up close to your ear and then move it away. And you will find that what you are hearing is different depending on how close your hand is to your ear. That will give you a sense of orientation to what's around you. If you are in, the same thing can be done if you bring your hand close to your face. You will find if you're talking or even whispering to yourself, you will find that you can tell where your hand is just by feeling the vibrations on your skin. That's an example of how it is that you can use other senses to compensate for senses that happen to be temporarily out of order. So what could you do if you use some of those other skills and other sensations that we haven't talked about. As I said, we already have sensory improvement devices. Best examples have been things for allowing the deaf to hear. Cochlear implants have allowed the deaf, and these can be chronically deaf or deaf from birth, to hear electrical impulses that the brain translates into sound. If you have seen the videos of a baby learning how to interpret electrical impulses once the cochlear implant is turned on, they're very confused at first and they have no idea what's going on. But within minutes, they have translated some of these electrical impulses into sound, and they can turn and focus on where it is that the sound is coming from, which is usually the mother, and they can associate the sound with the look on her face. If she's happy because she's talking to you and thinks that you're hearing her, you begin to associate pleasant sensations with the sound of her voice. That, of course, is a building block that you then take on into adulthood. Another one that has happened has been bionic eye implants. The initial ones were very, very crude. They allowed pinpricks of light to enter the visual cortex, and then the brain was allowed to translate it into images. Please excuse me, we have trains in our outside area here. All right. Eventually, this gets translated into the images that you have learned to recognize as patterns of light. With regard to artificial limbs, electrical impulses from the brain can be taught to create responses in mechanics such as hands, feet, fingers, and so on. Even in legs, you can teach a leg to an artificial leg to move, such, for instance, the people who have learned to run on artificial legs and run very fast. Those are just a few of the examples. There's a lot more out there. In all of those cases, what has happened is that the has rewired an unused portion of itself in order to allow it to make use of these new signals. So here's an example of some people who actually did some research on this. A Stanford researcher named Paul Bach-y-Rita created a patch with sensors that allowed volunteers to interpret signals as shapes. The signals were nothing more than little pinpricks of feeling, but over time they learned to associate, or their brain learned to associate those little patterns of pinpricks with various objects. And the objects were both objects themselves and had to do with proximity, in some cases with size. Currently, you're using researchers are using skull caps to transmit signals to the brain. In other words, the brain interprets these signals as sensations and responds accordingly. There's another device called the BrainPort that uses a camera on the forehead of a blind person, which is attached to the tongue with electrodes that are about a patch of 3 by 3 centimeters that delivers small shocks like pop rocks. And over time, you learn to interpret these shocks as colors and shapes and boundaries and distance and movement and things like that. You could actually place this interpretation patch, if you will, elsewhere on your body. And in some cases, it's been developed. Instead of necessarily little shocks, you could get pressure on certain kinds of things, and that will deliver information. One popular interpretation of this ability is the current ability to create foot pads that are worn as insoles and that deliver slight pressure to various known pressure points on your foot that are associated with various organs and various parts of your body. And theoretically, by creating a certain amount of pressure on this pressure point in your foot, you thereby command your shoulder to untense, or you command your hand to clench, or you command your eyelids to blink, or your heart to slow down a little bit, or your breath to your lungs to be able to take in a little bit more oxygen than it used to. These are in the woo-woo area of Oriental medicine, except that it has been proven. If you want to buy one of these little patches and try it on your, you doing kinds of interpretation of signals. So your brain is trying to constantly create meaning from various signals, and it interprets these signals as patterns and associations. For example, if you touch a surface, such as a keyboard, you rapidly learn that there are spaces between the keys, and you orient your fingers without looking at the keyboard as to which character has meaning for a particular letter or symbol. You can then learn to type without even looking at the keyboard. Well, some of you can. Other people will constantly hunt and peck. But the point is that that is an example of learning how to ascribe meaning to the sensation of a key being touched. But the key actually is part of it. The rest of it has to do with the relationship of that particular touch to other touch at the end of your fingers. In another case, it may be, for instance, that you're trying to stand on your toes, and you discover as you try to stand on your toes that there's a certain amount of balance involved. So as you go up on your toes, one of the other things that is happening is that the legs in your muscle are saying, you're going to tip over. So you adjust those things almost without thinking as you go up on your toes. And as you come down, you get your balance again. But you learn that the more you adjust the legs in your muscle, the better your balance is going to be. Suppose you could see more colors than we see. It has been demonstrated that most people see colors in three kinds of photoreceptors, and that some women use 4. There is another kind of thing whereby you wind up being able to ascribe colors to other sensations. For instance, some people think of certain kinds of music in terms of color patterns. That's a way of associating sounds with particular patterns. If you were to see those patterns, you would automatically recognize them as a particular set of notes, not necessarily a piece of music, but at least the notes would be recognizable. And in cataract surgery, normally your cornea filters out the ultraviolet light, but with the replacement of the artificial cornea, you don't filter that out anymore. So frequently patients will see more colors, especially in the ultraviolet and infrared areas, which is kind of interesting. You didn't notice this before, but when you come out into the world after corneal surgery, or actually cataract surgery, and you take the bandage off, you will suddenly see that your colors are expanded and you see things that you didn't see before. I don't know if any of you are as nearsighted as I am, but I noticed when I was young that when I came out of a doctor's office with a new set of glasses, I could suddenly see buildings that I had not remembered being there before, and that I was seeing them more brightly. This is an example of the kinds of adjustment that comes from expanding the ability of a particular part of the brain to interpret signals. Here's some examples of things that alter how it is that you use your senses. There is a device called a Fly VIZ that's worn as a helmet that allows you to have a 360-degree view of what's around you. It's been tested on the military, and at first the users are nauseated by the extra view. But when they get used to seeing objects around them, it makes a big difference in terms of the ability to tell, for instance, where you are and what's in your environment. But it also gives the military extra sensations about, for instance, people creeping up behind them, or extra armaments that weren't in their field of view before, or extra resources that they didn't realize were around them, but they couldn't see them with a regular 180-degree view. You felt the presence of these things, not necessarily see them. But training after the initial nausea takes almost no time at all. So if you were to get one of these things, you would learn to use it. There's already some of that in use with virtual reality helmets right now. You put them on and you're aware of things that are going on all around you, although it's all in virtual reality. In this particular case of the helmet and its descendants, you can use this in practical terms. To give you another example, when an airplane banks right or left or climbs or drops, you wind up knowing what's happening if you're paying attention, although there are no visual clues. The plane itself is your point of reference and it doesn't change. Your view of the other passengers is exactly the same. Your body may move a little bit with regard to gravity, but for the most part, you're not aware of a dropped wing or a drop in altitude other than those signals that are given you by gravity. But your ability to tell when in fact the plane is turning is something that involves using these extra pieces of brain that haven't been used before. Pilots use this all the time. They can tell, for instance, when they're banking, even though it may be they may be flying into a cloud. Many of them can tell where they are relative to certain ground radar, not necessarily because they can tell it from an instrument, but because they can feel it. Another example is a little device that you can be worn at the waist that buzzes when you are pointed to magnetic north. People who have worn this says that it gives you a better orientation as to buildings and streets and paths while you're hiking. It basically allows you to map your current environment in ways that normally you would not have been able to tell. And for some people, they can take it off and they can then orient themselves just because they can feel when they are pointed north, and so on. Now, I don't remember whether I have included, okay, I have, let me back up a minute here. Nope, I'm not going to back up. Okay. Yes, I am. There. One of the additional things that happens from this is that you can learn to tell the condition of a particular set of machinery or a particular set of circuits. There are people who can walk into a factory and tell where the machinery is and what's working and what isn't working, simply by feeling the electromechanical signals that are being given off by the machinery. There are other people, such as certain electronics technicians, who can tell that the wiring of a particular piece of machinery is off simply by being around the back of it where all the wires are. They don't necessarily have to touch the wire to be able to tell what's right and what's wrong. They can simply sense it. And the closer, for instance, their hand gets to a particular piece of machinery or a particular wire, the more they get sensation that something is either right or wrong with that particular circuit. And they can then remove that particular circuit, fix it, and replace it, knowing that they have fixed the problem. So here's another way. The author of the book that I took a lot of this from actually tried this experiment on a conference where there were a lot of people who were tweeting. He was wearing a vest that is available now that translated data into pressure signals. So when he was speaking, he learned that actually before he was speaking, he had learned to program the vest so that it would respond to the kinds of tweets that were being submitted by people in the audience. Through that, it then translated those tweets into pressures on the vest. And So he could tell almost instantly and adjust his presentation appropriately. So with that in mind, imagine what you could do if you could get instant feedback from, say you were doing an interview, and without necessarily having visual feedback from your interviewer, you were getting feedback from the emotions that they were feeling about your presentation and about receiving your comments in particular. Imagine, for instance, if you were trying to get information from your boss about how you had performed on a particular project, and your boss was not being particularly open about his opinions of you. If that vest or its descendant was being worn, you might be able to tell from various sensors on the vest what was going right or wrong about that particular interview and adjust what it is that you were going to say. So that's the end of my examples of these things, but I hope that this has really prompted a whole lot of thinking about what you could do with previously unused or underused parts of the brain. And I'm open to questions. Oh, and by the way, there's that information if you want it. Questions?
Great. Thank you so much, Elna. That was super interesting. We have a lot of questions. We had a first one from Judy that's pretty straightforward. When you were talking about the schizophrenic patients who had a probe inserted to their brain, and then they were remembering specific things. So the question was, when people remember things, they often change them a little or recall them differently from other participants. When the memories were stimulated in the brain by that touch probe, were they the original perception?
Could have been. Remember that it was a sequence of notes. It could very well be that that sequence of notes is associated with 5 other pieces of music, but the one that happens to come back is the one that was just to recall. In the case of, actually, I'm sorry, it wasn't a schizophrenic patient, it was a Parkinson's patient, a small thing. In this particular case, what was most interesting was the fact that it sparked a specific memory. And what that did is the probe touched a particular neural circuit that happened to connect those pieces into a particular memory.
So we had another question from Joyce. Do our brains delete info because there is a finite capacity and our brains are full, like a full disk drive?
We haven't reached that yet. People have tried. The problem is that there are also other factors that turned out to limit what it is that we remember. The most obvious one would be the kinds of brain-eating diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementia that destroy certain parts of the brain. Therefore, you can't remember what was associated with those parts of the brain. That doesn't mean that that capacity wasn't there. It means that it's offline. You can't get at it anymore. It's a little bit like a portion of a disk, pardon the older reference, being marked by an electrical signal so that you can't store data there anymore. It doesn't mean that the disk is full. It means that that particular portion isn't available.
Cool.
But thus far, we have not reached the limit of what it is that a brain can hold.
Great. We had an interesting comment and then a question that actually follows up, and this is more bordering onto philosophy than science. But so the question was, so is it possible to change our past by reconfiguring it? And then the comment,
Absolutely.
yeah, and then the comment was, and there is no reality or even one universe likely either if it's created individually in each person's brain.
Oh my, I won't get into the philosophical part, but I will say that recreating a memory is entirely possible. We see this all the time, particularly in the case of abuse victims. Many of them remember very vividly a particular set of actions that happened. However, over time, especially if they have been talking to others in a support group, they may find that their memory may be somewhat altered by what it is that they have heard others talk about with similar features. So when you recall it, you may actually have added a little detail from someone else's memory that changes what it is that you remembered. That can be as minor as the color of somebody's clothes or how their breath smelled, or it can be the wallpaper on the wall or anything of this sort. But the point is that that can be altered, and it has been demonstrated to be that way. That doesn't mean that the original memory was wrong. It means that your brain has used its excess capacity to create a new one, and you've decided that that one is what was real.
So we have a question from Nick, the host. That would be me. What do you think of the claims that we as a society will be able to augment and enhance human capability by direct brain reading and writing, like the Neuralink project is aiming to do?
Absolutely. It's going to happen. There are researchers around the world who were lucky enough to get research grants to study this, who are working on that particular subject. However, COVID and its long-term effects are having another spurt on this. One of the byproducts of severe COVID infection has been that it inflames the blood vessels and the blood vessels that go into the brain. Those inflamed blood vessels can't do a proper job of carrying nutrients to the brain, and therefore can change or at least affect in some way various kinds of places where memories are stalled. You can be augmenting an additional memory, or you can be creating a whole new idea by synthesizing other pieces of information into something else. Now, this sizing, of course, needs another place in order to store the references that allow that memory to come forward. So that's basically creating new territory, or actually using unused cupboards.
So we had a question from Diane.
Yeah.
How does the brain know to filter out signals from non-dominant sensory receptors? For example, normally sighted people rely on eyesight rather than skin sight, even though the brain normally receives signals from the skin as well. Is acuity a matter of excellent filtration or excellent signal reception?
Both, but more filtration. In trying to establish useful patterns, your brain will decide based on previous reactions what appears to be more useful information and what appears to be less useful information. And so it will tend to come down on the side of more useful information, and it learns to ignore that which it considers unuseful information.
Great. And then the next one, well, I'll probably have Diane come off of mute to ask this next one, because I'm not entirely sure what this question was. So Diane, get ready if you want to ask this. But her question is, what is the role of biophotons? Are there such things? What is the relationship between biochemicals and biophotons? Does light get translated into chemical signals in the 3D body?
Yes, light gets translated into electrical signals. That's how you see. Don't ask me, well, I can't tell you about how it is that happens, but I do know that a pinprick of light can get translated by the brain into an electrical signal, and therefore trigger certain things, convey certain information, say that something is needed here, then specify what kind it needs. Does that answer your question?
I don't really understand biophotons, but I'm curious about them since things move along in the brain a little faster than would normally be expected from electrical impulses. And so it's possible that it's actually packets of light that are moving rather than the electrical impulse itself. Now, I'm no chemist, I'm no electrical engineer, but I find this very curious. So perhaps biophotons are really the building block of brain activity rather than just the electrical signal. Do you know anything about this?
Let me give you an experiment to show how this works. Put your finger over your eye and press just a little bit. And what do you see? When I do that, you see patterns. And they are usually involved, well, in my case, it's colors and shapes. Those are actually the result of electrical signals. How is it that pressing on your brain, on your eyeball, created that particular pattern? It didn't result as a result. It did not result from pressure on the eyeball. Let me give you another example. If you look directly at the sun, you will quickly find that your ability to see anything out of that eye diminishes. It becomes a great dazzle. There's an example of biophotons, if you will, being overwhelmed and not being able to translate into the electrical signal that your brain is able to process.
So we have a few minutes left, and I think we have enough time just to get all of our questions in. So another question asked by me was, I'm wondering if there has ever been a study done that quantifies intuition and correlates it to extrasensory inputs.
Oh yeah. I can't quote the studies. But it turns out intuitive thinking is actually the brain at work making associations you are not consciously aware of. I marvel at the ability of the brain to create patterns or to recognize patterns even without you being aware of it. And intuition is basically recognizing a pattern that you haven't thought of before. That doesn't mean that you haven't thought of it before, but that you don't ever think about it before. It looks new to you. And as a result, neural connection for this particular revelation, if you will. But intuition, finely honed, is extremely useful in the creative process. It's an important capability to nurture and develop.
Awesome. So it's 3:55. There are no more written questions. If anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a verbal question, go ahead.
Thank you, Elna. This has been really interesting for a talk. And I liked your last question, Nick. The concepts of perceiving go back to ancient times, but only now do we have ability to really test it and to look at this with the proper tools. This greatly interests me right now. This, I think, will probably be my focus.
That's an intuitive thought. Keep up.
I see this being, well, definitely during some of the stuff that was happening in the 70s. And some of that, I don't want to get into the details on that, but it may not have been as moral as needed. But to look at this through quantum means and what tools are available and feedback, I think this is a very interesting field right now. We're finally able to measure these things the way that they, I think, need to be measured. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you both.
We had one other question from Barry that said the original info mentioned animals using other senses that we don't seem to have, such as using the earth, magnetic senses to find their way, etc. Do we think humans may have that sense but may not be using it?
Definitely. We will need mechanical devices of some sort to teach us how to use these. But as I mentioned before, when you can have somebody walk into a room and sense what kind of machinery is wrong because of the electromagnetic signals that it's giving off, that's an example of the kinds of things that are going on. Further, the ability to detect north by wearing a little buzzer, and that teaches you how to detect north. And then if you take the buzzer off, you learn how to detect magnetic north anyway. There's an example of teaching your brain how to interpret a signal as being directional of one sort or another. And publicized very much, but it is available.
I thought the human body did have a way to find north, and that we just lost the ability to connect with that because probably we're living in smaller communities and don't need to find our direction as much.
That may be. The Eskimos, for instance, are supposed to be able to know magnetic north very easily because it's part of their culture. I can't find magnetic north with my body yet, but suitably trained I could. I would imagine anybody could.
I think there's I was going to say the nose, but I think there's a part of our body that is pointing, like, that points direct north, and that's how we would be able to find our way. But
I doubt that it is a part of the body. It is an interpretation of signals that ultimately are electrical signals.
Elna, going
Yes.
back to animals. Now they can, for instance, my dog can sense when an earthquake, and other animals too, is ready to happen. Now, is this a specific sense they have? Do we have it? Because we have to use equipment at this time and we can measure it after the fact. But animals know before. Is this an extra sense they have?
Yes, this is an extra sense that they have. Actually, it is part of the same sensations that we have. We just haven't used it and developed it. No doubt they are picking up electrical signals, which are known to happen prior to an earthquake. It is part of the signals that can be picked up. For instance, USGS has signal processing equipment all along the San Andreas Fault.
Yeah.
And they can tell from the electrical signals received by that equipment within a couple of seconds prior to an earthquake happening. So what is happening then is that the animals are picking up on those signals or something like that and reacting immediately, whereas it takes a little bit more, a little longer for the electrical signals to get from the earth to the processing equipment, from there to the USGS office, and from there out to the radio stations that say, watch out for an earthquake.
So is there any kind of training that you know about that is going on for learning how to use different senses that we obviously have forgot how to use or never have used?
Yes, and there's too many of them to mention.
Oh, but there is training. Thank you.
Yes.
I think we'll have to cut it right there because we have gone an hour. It went fast. I want to very much thank Elna for the talk today, and I'll let her have the last word in a second. Again, you've been watching our December 2020 SF Mensa speaker, and we are very happy to have Elna speak and be in our group. She does a lot for our group, so I want to appreciate it. Anything else you want to end on, Elna? Any thoughts or anything?
Ask me away. I mean, ask away. I love doing these presentations because it requires me to do a little extra research in something that I'm already interested in. I am totally willing to continue the discussion with individuals. My email and phone number is on the last slide. Better not use the phone right now, but I'm pretty good at responding via email. Thank you very much for attending.